There is a thought that never announces itself. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it doesn't need to convince you. It simply repeats. This thought wakes up with you, walks beside your decisions, shapes what feels possible, and slips back into silence before you ever question it. You don't remember choosing it. You only remember living inside it. Most people believe their lives are guided by goals, values, or circumstances, but beneath all of that is something quieter. A single mental posture, a default assumption about who you are, what the world expects from you, and how much control you're allowed to feel. This is not a dramatic thought. That's why it's powerful. It feels reasonable, familiar, safe. Tonight, we are not here to fight it. We are here to notice it. And once you see it clearly, it may never control you in quite the same way again. The most powerful forces in your life are not the ones you remember agreeing to. They are the ones that settled in before you had language to resist them. This thought arrived early, earlier than memory, earlier than identity. It formed not as a sentence, but as a posture toward existence, a way the world felt before you ever learned to describe it. It might have sounded like survival, or expectation, or limitation, or urgency, but it wasn't a sentence yet. It was a feeling that repeated often enough to harden into truth. You didn't choose this thought because there was no you yet to choose. There was only a nervous system learning patterns, a brain wiring itself around what seemed consistent, predictable, and safe. If unpredictability surrounded you, the thought may have been, stay alert. If approval was conditional, the thought may have been, perform. If silence felt heavy, the thought may have been, fill the space. Whatever its shape, the thought embedded itself quietly, not as an idea, but as an assumption. And assumptions are powerful because they don't feel like thoughts at all. They feel like reality. You don't wake up thinking, I must prove myself today. You wake up already moving. This is how control works best. Not through commands, but through defaults. As you grew older, new thoughts appeared. Opinions, beliefs, preferences, but they didn't arrive to an empty room. They entered a space already shaped by this original orientation. Every new idea had to pass through it, bend around it, agree with it, or be rejected without explanation. This is why some thoughts feel natural and others feel exhausting. Not because they are true or false, but because they either align with the original thought or threaten it. You may notice this when you encounter a radically different way of living. Something inside you resists before logic arrives, not because it's wrong, but because it destabilizes the unseen center around which your life has been rotating. That resistance is not you thinking. It is the old thought defending its territory. The strange part is how personal this feels. The thought wears your voice. It uses your memories. It speaks in first person. Over time, you stop recognizing it as a thought at all. It becomes the narrator of your inner life. And narrators are trusted by default. When something goes wrong, the narrator explains why. When something feels impossible, the narrator justifies it. When you hesitate, the narrator fills the silence. You rarely question it, because questioning it feels like questioning yourself. But here is the quiet fracture in the story. The thought that controls your life must repeat to survive. If it were truly reality, it would not need constant reinforcement. Pay attention to how often the same internal explanations appear, the same emotional conclusions, the same limits drawn around what you believe you can change. Repetition is not proof of truth. It is proof of habit, and habits are learned. This does not mean the thought is evil. It likely once protected you. It helped you predict outcomes, avoid pain, or maintain belonging. But protection can become a prison when it outlives the danger that created it. The thought you never chose does not know that time has passed. It still reacts as if the conditions of its birth are present. It still assumes the same risks, the same consequences, the same boundaries, and because it operates beneath awareness, it continues to steer your life long after its original purpose has faded. Not by force, by familiarity. The beginning of freedom is not rebellion, it is recognition, and recognition begins by noticing something simple and unsettling. This thought is happening, but it is not happening because of you. It arrived before you knew how to say no. Truth is expensive. It costs attention, energy, and uncertainty. Stories are cheap. They come pre-packaged with meaning. The mind learns this early. When something happens, and you do not yet understand it, the brain does not wait patiently for clarity. Waiting feels dangerous. Instead, it assembles a story quickly, not to be accurate, but to be stable. Stability feels like safety. A story explains why something happened, who caused it, and what it says about you. Once assembled, it creates relief. The unknown shrinks, the nervous system relaxes, and in that relaxation, the story earns trust. This is why the mind prefers one story over truth. Truth unfolds slowly, stories arrive fully formed. Over time, the brain begins to favor explanations that resolve tension quickly, even if they distort reality. A story that calms you will be chosen over a truth that unsettles you, not because the mind is flawed, but because it is protective. The controlling thought you live inside depends on this preference. It doesn't need to be correct. It needs to be coherent. Once a story has explained your experiences often enough, it becomes the default lens through which new events are interpreted. Anything that fits strengthens it. Anything that doesn't is either ignored or rewritten. This is not dishonesty. It is efficiency. Consider how quickly the mind assigns meaning to neutral events. A delayed message becomes rejection. A quiet room becomes judgment. A mistake becomes identity. These are not conclusions reached through careful analysis. They are stories reaching for closure, and closure feels good. Truth, on the other hand, often arrives without comfort. It introduces complexity where the story promised simplicity. It refuses to settle neatly. It asks for patience. The brain has little patience for that. So it chooses the familiar story, again and again. This is how one thought gains authority, not by force, but by being the most available explanation in moments of uncertainty. When the mind does not know what something means, it reaches for what it already knows, even if what it knows is wrong. This preference becomes more pronounced under stress. Fatigue, fear, and emotional overwhelm reduce the mind's tolerance for ambiguity. In those moments, the controlling thought becomes louder, more convincing, more absolute. It presents itself as clarity. You may notice this in moments when life feels overwhelming. The story tightens. Explanations become rigid. Alternatives disappear. The world feels smaller, harsher, more predictable. That predictability is not truth. It is compression. The mind compresses reality into something it can manage. The danger is not that the story exists. The danger is that it goes unquestioned. Once the story becomes the primary interpreter of experience, it begins to shape behavior. Decisions are made in service of maintaining the story's consistency. You avoid what contradicts it. You pursue what confirms it. You explain away what threatens it. Slowly, your life begins to orbit the story, rather than the world itself. And because the story once provided relief, the mind defends it fiercely. Challenges to the story feel like personal attacks. Doubt feels destabilizing. Letting go feels like losing ground. This is why change feels so uncomfortable, even when it is clearly beneficial. The mind is not protecting the truth. It is protecting coherence. Truth can shatter coherence. Stories preserve it. The thought controlling your life is not necessarily the truest one. It is simply the one that has offered the most consistent explanation for your experiences. It has become familiar enough to feel inevitable. But inevitability is often just repetition mistaken for law. There is a quiet experiment you can run. The next time the familiar story appears, do not argue with it. Do not try to replace it with a better one. Simply notice the relief it brings. The softening, the sense of now I understand. That relief is the mind choosing comfort over curiosity. And once you see that choice happening, the story loosens its grip, not because you destroyed it, but because you stopped mistaking it for reality. Truth does not rush. It waits, and the mind will only notice it when it is willing to stay with discomfort a little longer than usual. There is a moment most people point to when they explain their lives. A choice, a turning point, a sentence that begins with, "That sips when I decided." This moment feels solid, almost sacred. It carries the weight of authorship. It reassures you that your life unfolded because you chose it to. But when you slow that moment down, something unsettling appears. The decision did not arrive first. Long before you felt like you were choosing, conditions were already shaping the outcome. Preferences were being trained. Fears were being rehearsed. Rewards and punishments were quietly teaching your nervous system what to lean toward and what to avoid. By the time awareness arrived, the field of options had already narrowed. The illusion of the first decision exists because consciousness arrives late. It observes the result of internal processes already in motion, then claims ownership retroactively. The mind tells a story backward, assigning intention to momentum. This is not a flaw. It is how narration works. You experience the conclusion, then invent the cause. Neuroscience has hinted at this without fully absorbing its weight. Brain activity predicting decisions appears before conscious awareness reports choosing. But the deeper implication is not that choice disappears. It is that authorship is mislocated. You feel like the source, but you may be the witness. The controlling thought depends on this illusion. It waits until a pattern has already played out, then steps forward and says, "This is what you wanted," or worse, "This is who you are." Because the explanation arrives confidently, you accept it. Think of a decision you believe defines you, a path you took, a role you inhabit, a belief you defend. Trace it backward honestly, not to the moment you chose, but to the forces that made that choice feel inevitable. What discomfort were you escaping? What approval were you chasing? What alternative felt unsafe, unrealistic, or forbidden? Those forces were already shaping the outcome before choice entered the story. The mind often mistakes inevitability for intention. Once a pattern gains momentum, continuing it feels like choosing, interrupting it feels like danger. Resistance feels wrong, not because it is irrational, but because it threatens stability. This is how the illusion hardens. You didn't decide to become cautious, driven, pleasing, guarded, or restless. You responded repeatedly to conditions until those responses stabilized. The controlling thought then wrapped language around that stability and called it identity. From that point on, future choices followed a script. The illusion deepens because memory edits itself. Moments that support the story are highlighted. Moments that contradict it fade. Over time, your personal history becomes evidence for a narrative of control that was never quite there. This is why identity feels consistent. It is curated. Yet there are moments that don't fit. Moments when you acted out of character, when you surprised yourself, when something moved through you without rehearsal. These moments feel strange because they are unscripted. They reveal something important. The first decision never truly existed. What existed was accumulation. Thousands of micro-adjustments made under pressure, reward, imitation, and fear. Only later did the mind compress them into a single moment of agency. This compression is comforting. It gives the self a beginning, a sense of command, a clean explanation. But life does not operate in clean beginnings. Believing in the first decision creates a quiet trap. If you believe your life is anchored to a defining choice, you will spend your energy defending that choice rather than examining the system that continues to produce your behavior. You will ask, how do I stay consistent with who I decided to be? Instead of, what keeps deciding for me now? The controlling thought prefers the first question. It freezes identity. It turns behavior into loyalty. It makes change feel like betrayal. But loyalty to an outdated pattern is still control. There is relief in seeing this clearly, not because responsibility disappears, but because blame softens. You are not broken for repeating yourself. You are patterned, and patterns can be observed. When you stop searching for the mythical first decision, attention returns to the present. You begin to notice the quiet reinforcements, the way attention leans, the way avoidance feels justified, the way familiarity disguises itself as preference. This is where change actually lives. Not in dramatic declarations, not in reinvention stories, but in noticing what is still choosing for you, again and again. The illusion of the first decision dissolves gently. It does not collapse. It fades as one realization settles in. You were never late to your life. You were just not steering in the way you were taught to believe. A thought does not become powerful because it is convincing. It becomes powerful because it repeats. The mind does not treat truth as law. It treats familiarity as authority. When a thought appears once, it is just an event. When it appears twice, it is coincidence. But when it appears again and again, under similar emotional conditions, it begins to feel structural, not like an idea, but like the way things are. Repetition is the mechanism through which thoughts stop feeling optional. Each time a thought repeats, the brain expends slightly less energy processing it. Neural pathways strengthen, resistance weakens. The thought becomes easier to access, faster to believe, harder to interrupt. Eventually it stops feeling like a thought at all. It feels like a rule. This is how internal laws are written, not by logic, but by exposure. The controlling thought in your life did not earn its authority by being examined. It earned it by being rehearsed, often during moments of emotional intensity, uncertainty, or vulnerability. These moments act like ink, fixing the thought more deeply into the system. A thought repeated during fear is remembered differently than one repeated during calm. A thought repeated during shame is weighted more heavily than one repeated during confidence. Emotion stamps permanence. Over time, the mind begins to treat these repeated thoughts as predictive tools. If a thought has accompanied many situations, the brain assumes it must be useful, it must be accurate, it must be trusted. So the thought is promoted. It moves from suggestion to assumption, from assumption to expectation, from expectation to invisible law. You stop noticing it, because laws are not argued with. They are obeyed. This is why certain thoughts feel non-negotiable, why alternatives feel unrealistic, even before you examine them, why questioning the thought produces discomfort rather than curiosity. The discomfort is not intellectual, it is neurological. Challenging a deeply repeated thought creates friction in the system. It demands energy, it introduces uncertainty, and the brain, designed to conserve resources, resists that demand, so it redirects attention. It justifies, it distracts, it repeats the law again, quietly reinforcing it. This is how repetition becomes self-sealing. The thought predicts reality. Reality appears to confirm the thought. The confirmation encourages repetition. The repetition strengthens the thought. A closed loop forms. Once a thought reaches this stage, it no longer waits for evidence. It interprets evidence. Events are filtered to fit the law. Contradictions are reframed or dismissed. Confirmations are highlighted and remembered. This is not conscious bias. It is automation. The thought has become infrastructure. You may notice this in how quickly you arrive at conclusions, how certain interpretations feel obvious, how explanations surface before you realize you're explaining anything. The law speaks first, and because it speaks in your voice, it feels like you. Repetition also creates identity. When a thought repeats consistently enough, the mind begins to associate it with selfhood. I am the kind of person who thinks this way. What began as habit becomes personality. At that point, challenging the thought feels like attacking the self. Letting go feels like loss. Change feels like erasure. This is why insight alone rarely dissolves control. Understanding a thought does not undo its repetition history. Laws are not dismantled by arguments. They are weakened by lack of enforcement. And enforcement happens through attention. Every time you mentally rehearse a familiar explanation, even critically, you strengthen its pathway. Every time you narrate yourself through the same lens, you renew its authority. This is why the controlling thought does not need to be dramatic. It needs to be constant. Most people live inside mental laws they never consciously endorsed. Laws about worth, laws about danger, laws about limitation, laws about what is allowed to feel easy or hard. These laws do not announce themselves. They operate silently, shaping behavior long before choice enters awareness. But there is a quiet vulnerability in every law. It must be enforced repeatedly to remain alive. When repetition pauses, even briefly, the law weakens. Not immediately, not spectacularly, but subtly, a gap appears. A moment where the thought does not arrive on time. That gap can feel disorienting, even uncomfortable. The mind rushes to fill it, to restore order. But if the gap is noticed rather than filled, something shifts. For the first time, the law is revealed as a pattern rather than a necessity, and once seen as a pattern, it becomes possible to relate to it differently, not to fight it, not to replace it, but to stop mistaking repetition for truth. Because the most controlling thoughts are not the loud ones. They are the ones that repeat so faithfully, so quietly, that they no longer feel like thoughts at all. Before you understood rules, you learned patterns. Before you understood consequences, you felt them. Childhood is not remembered as a contract, but it functions like one, an unspoken agreement formed through repetition, emotion, and necessity. No signature was required. Survival was enough. As a child, you did not analyze the world. You absorbed it. You watched what brought warmth closer and what made it retreat. You noticed which behaviors softened faces and which tightened them. You learned when attention arrived and when it disappeared. From these observations, agreements formed. Not consciously, not verbally, but somatically. The body learned first. It learned what to do to remain safe, connected, or unseen. It learned which parts of you were welcomed and which were inconvenient. And slowly, without ceremony, it agreed to adapt. The agreement might have sounded like silence, or usefulness, or excellence, or invisibility. or emotional restraint, but it was not phrased as a thought. It was felt as necessity. Children do not question conditions. They comply with them, not out of weakness, but out of intelligence. The nervous system prioritizes continuity. It finds ways to belong inside whatever environment exists. And belonging feels like survival. So when the environment repeated certain emotional patterns, the child adjusted. If love followed achievement, achievement became identity. If calm followed compliance, compliance became safety. If attention followed distress, distress became signal. These were not choices. They were negotiations. A quiet agreement formed. This is how I will be. So the world stays predictable. The controlling thought often originates here, not as an abstract belief, but as a bodily promise, a vow made before language, reinforced before reflection. As you grew older, the original environment faded. Faces changed. Contexts shifted, but the agreement remained active. It had worked once. The nervous system saw no reason to abandon it. So it continued to enforce the same rules in new situations. You may notice this when reactions feel disproportionate, when a small moment triggers a large internal response, when approval feels unusually relieving, when disapproval feels unusually threatening. The body is honoring an old agreement. The tragedy is not that the agreement exists. The tragedy is that it is mistaken for identity. Over time, the mind wraps language around the agreement. It becomes a personality trait, a value, a worldview. I'm just like this. This is how I am. The agreement disappears behind explanation. And because it was never conscious, it cannot be remembered as a choice. It feels permanent, natural, non-negotiable. But agreements made under necessity are not eternal laws. They were adaptive responses to a specific world. The child did not agree because the terms were fair. The child agreed because the alternative felt unsafe, and safety, at that stage, mattered more than truth, authenticity, or possibility. The controlling thought draws strength from this origin. It carries emotional weight because it was once protective. Challenging it can feel like endangering the child who relied on it. This is why resistance appears when change approaches. Not intellectual resistance, but emotional tightening. The system reacts as if something vital is being threatened. It is, but not your survival. It is the agreement SIP's relevance. There is a subtle grief in recognizing this, realizing that parts of your life have been guided by a contract you never consciously signed. The behaviors you defend may be relics of an environment that no longer exists. This grief is not something to bypass. It is evidence that something meaningful once depended on that agreement, but seeing it clearly changes its authority. When you recognize the agreement as historical rather than essential, a space opens. The body may still react, but the mind no longer has to obey automatically. You begin to notice the agreement activating, the familiar urge, the familiar explanation, the familiar tightening. And instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you ask, "What was this protecting me from?" That question does not break the agreement. It softens it, because agreements made in childhood persist only as long as they remain unquestioned, not challenged aggressively, but examined gently. The controlling thought does not want you to remember this origin. It prefers to appear timeless, authoritative, unconditional. But once you see the agreement as a response rather than a rule, its grip loosens. It becomes one strategy among many, rather than the only way to exist. The child inside you does not need the same protections anymore, but the system has not been informed. That update begins with awareness, not confrontation, not rejection, but recognition. And in that recognition, the agreement begins to renegotiate itself. Nothing in your life changes without attention, moving first. Events happen constantly, but only a few feel real. Only a few leave impressions. Only a few become memories, decisions, or identity. The difference is not importance. It is attention. Attention is not neutral. It is selective pressure. Where attention rests, reality thickens. Where it withdraws, things flatten and fade. This is not philosophy. It is how the nervous system allocates meaning. Attention determines what is processed deeply enough to shape behavior. The controlling thought understands this implicitly. It does not need to control your actions directly. It only needs to influence where your attention lingers. Once attention is captured, interpretation follows automatically. Emotion attaches. Memory records. The loop strengthens. Attention is the lever because it precedes choice. You do not choose what draws your attention. Attention is pulled by salience, emotion, familiarity, and threat. By the time you are deciding, attention has already framed the field. This is why certain details dominate your awareness while others remain invisible, why some possibilities feel obvious, and others never occur to you. The controlling thought quietly biases attention toward confirming material. It highlights what supports the story. It dims what contradicts it. It repeats this filtering until it feels natural. Over time, attention becomes trained. You begin to notice the same patterns everywhere. The same flaws, the same dangers, the same opportunities. The world appears to agree with you, not because it does, but because attention has been taught where to look. This training is reinforced emotionally. Attention lingers longer on what feels charged. Fear sharpens focus. Desire narrows it. Familiar discomfort keeps it locked in place. Calm, on the other hand, diffuses attention, making control harder. This is why the controlling thought often carries an emotional hook: anxiety, urgency, self-judgment. These emotions act like glue, holding attention in place long enough for the thought to reinforce itself. The moment attention wanders, the law weakens. You may notice this during moments of absorption. When you are deeply engaged, creative, or present, the controlling thought quiets, not because it was defeated, but because attention was elsewhere. It starves without attention. Yet attention is rarely experienced as something you can influence. It feels automatic, pulled rather than placed. This creates the illusion that the controlling thought is external or inevitable. But attention is not fixed. It is conditioned. Every time you dwell on a familiar explanation, you train attention to return there more quickly next time. Every time you mentally rehearse a worry, attention learns that this territory matters. The lever becomes easier to pull. This is why insight alone does not dissolve control. Seeing the thought does not change where attention habitually rests. Attention must be retrained through experience, not argument. And this retraining begins with noticing the moment attention locks. Notice how quickly it narrows when discomfort appears. Notice how it circles familiar conclusions. Notice how alternative interpretations fail to hold interest. This noticing is subtle. It does not interrupt the process immediately, but it introduces friction. For the first time, attention becomes visible. When attention is seen, it loosens. Not dramatically, but enough to create a gap. In that gap, the controlling thought loses momentum. It must work harder to reclaim focus. This is why silence feels uncomfortable at first. Silence removes obvious objects for attention to cling to. Without a familiar anchor, attention drifts. The mind rushes to supply content. It supplies the controlling thought. But if attention is allowed to rest without immediately attaching, something unexpected happens. The world widens. Details appear that were previously filtered out. Possibilities that once felt unrealistic begin to feel neutral. Not attractive, just possible. This neutrality is dangerous to control, because the controlling thought depends on attention being narrow, focused, repetitive. Once attention broadens, the thought loses its privileged position. It becomes one object among many, rather than the center. This does not require force. It requires patience. Attention cannot be commanded, but it can be invited, gently redirected, allowed to explore without immediate judgment. Over time, this soft redirection weakens the old pathways. The lever still exists, but it is no longer locked in one position. You begin to see how much of your world was shaped, not by facts, but by where attention was habitually placed. How many experiences were missed. How many interpretations went unchallenged, simply because attention never lingered there. This realization is not empowering in a dramatic sense. It is quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it changes everything. Because once you see that attention moves the world you experience, the controlling thought is revealed for what it is. Not a ruler, not a truth, but a guide that only works when you keep following it. And attention, once noticed, does not obey quite so automatically anymore. Some thoughts arrive quietly, but they carry a strange authority. They do not feel like visitors. They feel like ownership. When these thoughts appear, you do not observe them. You identify with them. They feel intimate, personal, unquestionable. They speak in your voice, with your memories, using your language. They feel like you. This feeling does not come from accuracy. It comes from proximity. Thoughts that repeat near emotional centers of the brain gain special status. They are linked to survival, attachment, and self-preservation. Over time, The mind associates them with identity rather than information. A thought paired often enough with emotion becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes trust. Trust becomes selfhood. This is why not all thoughts feel equal. Some pass by like noise, others anchor themselves at the center of experience. The controlling thought works by occupying this center. It does not present itself as an idea to be evaluated. It presents itself as a perspective from which evaluation happens. You do not hear it and think, "Is this true?" You hear it and think, "Of course." That sense of obviousness is learned. From early on, certain thoughts were rewarded. They brought approval, reduced conflict, or restored a sense of control. Other thoughts created friction. They led to discomfort, confusion, or rejection. The nervous system learned which thoughts to keep close. Over time, the mind began to tag these favored thoughts as mine, not through conscious labeling, but through repeated emotional reinforcement. The more often a thought solved a problem, the more central it became. Eventually, it stopped feeling like a solution. It felt like a fact about you. This is how identity forms, not as a fixed entity, but as a cluster of thoughts that have proven useful often enough to be mistaken for self. You may notice this when certain thoughts feel offensive to question, when doubt feels like betrayal, when alternative viewpoints feel wrong before they are examined. These reactions are not philosophical. They are protective. Questioning an identity-linked thought threatens coherence. It destabilizes the narrative that holds the self together. The system responds with discomfort, defensiveness, or urgency. The controlling thought relies on this reaction. It hides behind the feeling of me, but there is a subtle clue that reveals the illusion. Thoughts that feel like you are not consistent. They shift with mood, context, fatigue, and environment. The voice changes. The certainty fluctuates. The perspective narrows or widens. If it were truly you, it would not be so conditional. Notice how different thoughts feel when you are rested versus exhausted, calm versus anxious, safe versus threatened. The you that speaks in each state sounds remarkably different, yet each one claims ownership. This should raise a question. Which one is you? The mind avoids this question by flattening complexity. It selects a few dominant thought patterns and labels them identity. Everything else is treated as deviation or error. But identity is not a single voice. It is a chorus, constantly reorganizing itself around circumstance. The controlling thought becomes the conductor by repeating the loudest, most emotionally charged parts. It creates the illusion of continuity. This illusion is comforting. It gives the self a stable center, a sense of sameness across time. But stability is not the same as truth. The reason certain thoughts feel like you is not because they originate from some inner essence. It is because they have been rehearsed, rewarded, and protected long enough to feel familiar. Familiarity breeds ownership. Once ownership is assumed, the thought gains immunity. You defend it instinctively. You justify it automatically. You experience its conclusions as personal insights rather than conditioned responses. This is why change feels threatening. Letting go of a thought that feels like you feels like disappearing. But notice something important. Even when these thoughts quiet, you remain. In moments of deep focus, presence, or stillness, the familiar identity thoughts recede, and yet awareness continues. Experience continues. Something observes without narrating. That observer does not feel like a thought. It feels like space. The controlling thought cannot survive in that space. It needs identification. It needs to be believed. It needs to be mistaken for you. When it is seen as something appearing rather than something being, its authority weakens. Not instantly, not completely, but enough. You begin to notice the moment identification happens, the moment a thought crosses from event to identity, and in that noticing, a gap opens. The thought still appears, but it no longer owns you. It becomes possible to experience it without becoming it. This is not detachment. It is clarity. And clarity does something quietly radical. It returns authorship where it belongs, not to the thought, but to the awareness that notices it. The mind has a quiet hunger. It craves order, coherence, and continuity. Chaos is experienced as danger. Fragmentation feels like threat. To navigate the endless stream of experience, the brain constructs a central narrator, a voice that stitches moments into a story, sensations into identity, and events into meaning. This narrator does not emerge for philosophical reasons. It emerges for survival. The brain must predict the world, anticipate outcomes, and decide responses. To do this efficiently, It requires a lens through which everything is filtered. Otherwise, perception becomes scattered, memory unreliable, and action indecisive. The central narrator solves this problem elegantly. It provides a seamless me that links past, present, and anticipated future. It gives life continuity. You feel like a single entity rather than a collection of fragmented impulses, reactions, and observations. But the narrator has its own agenda. It seeks stability over truth, coherence over nuance, and familiarity over exploration. In its pursuit of consistency, it co-opts thoughts that align with its story and marginalizes those that do not. The more a thought fits, the more it is amplified. The more it contradicts, the more it is suppressed or ignored. This is where the controlling thought finds fertile ground. It does not need force. It simply aligns with the narrator's preferences. It repeats in predictable patterns, mirrors familiar emotional responses, and reinforces continuity. Over time, it becomes part of the narrator's voice. Its conclusions are interpreted as personal insight, its urgencies as self-preservation. You do not notice the takeover because it wears your voice. The narrator also assigns moral and emotional weight. Thoughts consistent with its story are rewarded with a sense of rightness, certainty, and emotional ease. Thoughts that threaten the story trigger discomfort, anxiety, or shame. This emotional reinforcement trains attention and memory to favor the dominant narrative. Over time, the narrator becomes the lens through which everything is experienced, and the controlling thought the backbone of that lens. Awareness of the narrator is rare. It is not something taught. It is something glimpsed. Most people mistake the narrator for consciousness itself. They believe the voice they hear is the entirety of their mind, unaware of the processes shaping, filtering, and evaluating every perception and reaction. This misconception strengthens control, because the thought embedded in the narrator appears inseparable from the self. The narrator also reduces ambiguity. Life is full of uncertainty, unexpected events, unpredictable reactions, competing desires. The narrator simplifies complexity by providing explanations before reflection, interpretations before observation. It tells you why someone acted a certain way, why you felt a certain emotion, and what that means about yourself. Even if the explanation is inaccurate, it reduces the cognitive load and emotional tension. The brain rewards this reduction with comfort, reinforcing the pattern further. This central narrator is adaptive, but not infallible. It sacrifices accuracy for continuity, insight for predictability. Its allegiance is not to reality, but to the semblance of self-consistency. And when a thought aligns with its goal of coherence, it gains authority that feels intrinsic, undeniable, and permanent. This is why certain controlling thoughts feel inseparable from identity. They have been integrated into the narrator's ongoing story. Yet, there is a hidden fracture. The narrator depends on unbroken attention, habitual responses, and unquestioned familiarity. Interruptions, moments of presence, curiosity, or doubt, expose the constructed nature of the story. Awareness glimpsing repetition, noticing bias, or observing automatic emotional reactions creates cracks. The narrator cannot maintain the illusion of seamless authorship when gaps appear. The controlling thought, tethered to the narrator, weakens. Recognizing the narrator is subtle. It requires noticing not the content of thoughts, but the pattern by which they appear, the voice through which they are repeated, and the emotional authority they carry. The narrator feels like you because it organizes experience in the first person. It tells a story in your voice, but voice is not authorship. Pattern is not destiny. Once this distinction is glimpsed, something quietly radical occurs. You realize that the controlling thought is not sovereign. It is part of a larger system, a system designed to predict, simplify, and protect, not necessarily to reflect reality. Awareness creates space between the narrator and the narrative. The voice remains, but its authority diminishes. Observation replaces automatic compliance. Choice replaces unquestioned repetition. The central narrator will continue to exist. It is necessary for navigating life, but awareness allows you to discern which stories are inherited, which thoughts are habitual, and which beliefs are being mistaken for truth. The controlling thought is no longer the unquestioned ruler. It becomes a participant in a broader conversation, a voice that can be noticed, understood, and gently redirected. In that space, identity transforms, not by erasing the narrator, but by seeing it clearly, not by silencing the thought, but by understanding its role. The narrator remains, but its story is no longer absolute. The controlling thought is no longer invisible. and the mind begins to experience its own structure without mistaking it for destiny. Not all thoughts are equal. Some feel warm, familiar, almost protective. Others carry tension, challenge, or unease. The mind quickly categorizes these experiences: comfort thoughts and dangerous thoughts. Understanding the distinction is crucial because the controlling thought relies on this classification to maintain authority. Comfort thoughts are easy to believe. They arrive with relief, familiarity, or a sense of validation. They reinforce existing patterns, confirm the central narrator, and maintain cohesion. They reassure the mind that everything is predictable, familiar, and under control. When a comfort thought appears, the body relaxes, tension decreases, attention locks in. The thought gains authority not through logic, but through emotional reinforcement. These thoughts feel like home. They align with the stories the brain has rehearsed since childhood. They echo the agreements formed in early environments. They tell you you are safe, you are understood, you belong. Even when these thoughts limit possibility or distort reality, their emotional resonance makes them compelling. Dangerous thoughts operate differently. They introduce friction, uncertainty, or contradiction. They ask questions, reveal gaps, or challenge identity. They disrupt the smooth operation of the central narrator. Their arrival triggers tension, discomfort, doubt, hesitation, or anxiety. The body stiffens. Attention struggles to remain neutral. These thoughts demand energy because they break habitual loops. The danger lies in misinterpreting comfort as truth. Because comfort feels right, the mind mistakes repetition and ease for accuracy. Familiarity becomes credibility. Reassurance becomes authority. The controlling thought, cloaked in emotional ease, presents itself as self-evidence. You do not need to question it, because questioning feels uncomfortable, even threatening. The controlling thought is highly attuned to this distinction. Its strategy is simple: amplify comfort, suppress danger. Comfort thoughts are repeated, rehearsed, and rewarded. Dangerous thoughts are ignored, reframed, or suppressed. Over time, the brain associates safety with the familiar and threat with the unfamiliar. This wiring ensures that controlling thoughts rarely face effective challenge. Dangerous thoughts, by contrast, are avoided. They provoke hesitation and introspection. The mind learns to escape them to maintain equilibrium, and each time a dangerous thought is avoided, the controlling thought strengthens. Its pathways are reinforced, its authority cemented, its rule normalized. The nervous system learns to prioritize comfort over curiosity, repetition over exploration, certainty over truth. This pattern explains much of human rigidity. Habits, beliefs, and behaviors persist not because they are correct or rational, but because they feel comfortable. They are repeated, reinforced, and integrated into the narrative. Challenges, whether internal doubts or external realities, feel risky, even existential. Compliance with comfort becomes the path of least resistance. Obedience to the controlling thought becomes almost automatic. But the dichotomy is deceptive. Comfort is not always benign. Dangerous is not always harmful. A comfort thought may reinforce limitation, fear, or identity traps. A dangerous thought may introduce insight, opportunity, or freedom. The controlling thought capitalizes on this confusion. It labels difficulty as dangerous and safety as mandatory. What feels easy becomes unquestioned law. What feels uncomfortable becomes forbidden territory. In this space, the controlling thought loses its immunity. Comfort is no longer automatically obeyed. Danger is no longer automatically avoided. Repetition continues, but it is no longer mistaken for law. Familiarity and tension become data, not destiny. Awareness becomes the subtle lever that separates obedience from observation. Awareness shifts this dynamic. Observing the emotional coloration of thoughts reveals which are comfort and which are labeled dangerous. Recognizing that a thought feels good or bad does not automatically assign it truth. Comfort becomes a signal rather than a verdict. Danger becomes an invitation rather than a threat. This subtle reframing weakens the controlling thought's authority because it no longer masquerades as absolute necessity. The shift is quiet but profound. When you notice comfort without immediately following it, and notice danger without fleeing, you reclaim attention. You begin to see that emotional resonance is not a reliable measure of validity. You start to observe patterns rather than obey them. The mind learns that it can engage with uncomfortable thoughts safely and question familiar ones critically. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of authority shifts. The controlling thought remains, but it is no longer the unquestioned ruler of your inner landscape. You are no longer fully captive to the emotional gravity of repetition. You begin to inhabit a space where insight, curiosity, and discernment coexist with habit, preference, and pattern. Language is not neutral. It is not merely a tool for communication. It is the structure through which thought gains permanence, authority, and identity. A fleeting feeling becomes a concept, an experience becomes a memory, and a pattern becomes a rule, all through language. The controlling thought relies on this mechanism to secure its grip. Once named, described, and repeated, a thought gains stability it could never achieve in raw sensation alone. Consider the difference between feeling afraid and thinking I am anxious. One is ephemeral, a fluctuation in the nervous system. The other is a label, a summary, a claim about reality and self. Language crystallizes the moment. It gives it borders, coherence, and weight. By naming a thought, the mind treats it as a thing, rather than a passing event. It becomes concrete, reportable, and internally defendable. Repetition compounds this effect. Each time a thought is named, described, or narrated, it strengthens its presence. It is rehearsed, archived, and reinforced. Over time, the mind begins to treat it as law, rather than event. The narrative structure of identity leans on it. Thoughts that were once tentative now feel inevitable. Language transforms ambiguity into authority. The controlling thought leverages this process subtly. It embeds itself in habitual phrases, self-descriptions, and internal narratives. Words like I can't, I always, I should, or I am serve as anchors. Each time you use them, consciously or unconsciously, the thought gains structure. It is no longer a fleeting impulse. It becomes a template, a default lens through which experiences are interpreted. Language also narrows perception. Once a concept exists, the mind filters experiences to fit it. For example, calling yourself shy encourages the brain to notice moments of hesitation, social discomfort, or withdrawal. Other moments, confidence, assertiveness, spontaneity, fade or are dismissed. The word creates a frame. The thought solidifies within that frame. The controlling thought is never challenged because the frame itself filters evidence. Metaphor and internal dialogue amplify this effect. A single metaphor, life is a battle, I am a failure, the world is dangerous, reorients attention, emotion, and memory. Experiences are interpreted to fit the metaphor. Feeling becomes reasoning. Reasoning becomes identity. The language traps the mind by giving abstract concepts a persistent, persuasive presence. What was once malleable now feels immutable. Even self-reflection can reinforce the lock. When thoughts are analyzed, labeled, or categorized in journals, conversations, or internal narration, the mind mistakes engagement for mastery. Writing, I am anxious repeatedly, does not dissolve the pattern. It reinforces it. Insight, without interruption of repetition, maintains the thought's authority. Language gives the controlling thought both voice and permanence. This effect is amplified by social feedback. Language allows others to recognize, repeat, and validate your internal patterns. Phrases you use to describe yourself become invitations for others to respond in ways that reinforce them. Praise, correction, or agreement acts as reinforcement. The controlling thought grows stronger because it is confirmed externally as well as internally. Yet, the paradox is subtle. Language can also free thought. Awareness of labeling, naming, and narrative framing creates a space where the controlling thought is revealed as constructed. Recognizing that I am anxious is a phrase, not a truth, introduces distance. Observation can replace identification. The grip loosens, not because words disappear, but because their authority is questioned. The key lies in noticing how language functions. Observe habitual phrases. Notice which labels are repeated automatically. Attend to metaphors that dominate self-narration. Ask who is speaking, and is this voice the same as me, or the controlling thought masquerading as me? This awareness does not require argument. It requires presence. It allows language to be experienced as a tool rather than a cage. Language locks thought in place by giving impermanent experiences permanence, by converting sensation into rule, by narrating identity. But language can also unlock thought, if you see its construction and choose not to obey it blindly. Awareness of the frame does not erase the frame. It frees the observer to decide which parts to inhabit, which to question, and which to release. In that freedom, the controlling thought remains, but it no longer commands unquestioned allegiance. It is one voice among many in the fluid, observer-accessible landscape of the mind. Memory is not a neutral record of events. It is selective, interpretive, and deeply biased. The mind does not simply store experiences, it filters, emphasizes, and distorts them in ways that shape attention, expectation, and identity. Memory decides what feels important, what feels dangerous, and what feels familiar. In this way, it becomes one of the quietest yet most powerful tools of the controlling thought. From early life onward, patterns are embedded. Experiences that provoke strong emotion, fear, shame, joy, or awe, are encoded with heightened priority. Repetition reinforces them. The mind does not distinguish between utility and narrative. It remembers what sticks, what feels real, what has been reinforced by repetition or approval. Over time, these selections become the lens through which new experiences are interpreted. Memory dictates attention. When you enter a room, meet a person, or encounter a situation, the brain does not process everything equally. It privileges information that aligns with prior patterns, faces, tones, and actions that echo past experiences stand out. Others fade into background. The controlling thought exploits this by reinforcing patterns that confirm its authority. Memories that support identity, limitation, or habitual fears are automatically prioritized. Those that contradict them are marginalized, suppressed, or reframed. This selection creates a feedback loop. Memory influences perception. Perception confirms memory. The controlling thought sits at the center, interpreting the cycle as truth. Because memories are selectively amplified, the world appears to agree with the narrative already rehearsed inside the mind. Experiences are not neutral. They are colored by the archive of what the mind has learned to notice. The effect is subtle, almost invisible. You may notice yourself reacting strongly to certain stimuli, while ignoring others. You may find yourself drawn to familiar patterns of thought, emotion, or behavior, even when they are limiting or unhelpful. Memory has prearranged the stage, and attention steps onto it almost automatically. What feels spontaneous is often guided by the archive of repeated experience. Language interacts with memory to reinforce this effect. Labels, stories, and internal narratives connect past experiences to present perception. The thought "I am anxious in social situations" is not a fact pulled from immediate reality. It is a condensed memory of patterns that were encoded in attention and emotion over time. Memory, combined with language, crystallizes the controlling thought, making it feel both inevitable and essential. Memory also distorts chronology and causality. The mind favors coherence over accuracy. Events are remembered selectively to maintain narrative stability. Successes are attributed to skill, failures to circumstance, or vice versa, depending on the controlling thought's bias. Memory edits itself to justify repeated patterns. The controlling thought is thus protected not only in the present but across time, appearing consistent, logical, and necessary. This is why insight alone rarely dismantles control. You can observe a thought, question it, even doubt it, but the archive of memory continues to feed attention and expectation. Experiences are interpreted according to patterns that are already reinforced. The controlling thought benefits from this invisible infrastructure. It does not need to compel behavior directly. It only needs to maintain its memory-driven scaffolding. Yet, memory is not immutable. Awareness introduces flexibility. When you notice how memory biases perception, a subtle gap opens. You realize that not every memory is definitive. Not every pattern is unchallengeable. You begin to see that attention can wander beyond the usual selections, that new experiences can be noticed, and that habitual reactions can be questioned. This does not erase the past, but it changes its influence. The controlling thought loses its automatic authority. Memory remains, but it becomes data rather than destiny. Patterns are visible, not unquestionable. Familiarity is recognized, not obeyed blindly. Experiences can be approached with curiosity rather than assumption. Memory decides what you notice, but noticing that process gives you choice. Awareness acts as a lever between past and present. It does not destroy memory's function, but transforms its role. From a silent dictator, memory becomes a guide, informative, conditional, and participatory. The controlling thought persists, but its power is no longer absolute. In that shift, the mind begins to inhabit a space where patterns can be seen without being obeyed. Memory still informs, still colors, still influences, but it no longer dictates. Attention can step freely, curiosity can explore, and experience can exist beyond rehearsal. The controlling thought remains, but it is observed rather than automatically believed. Thoughts are rarely solitary. They arrive intertwined with emotion, each shaping the other. Emotions act as amplifiers, anchors, and validators for the ideas that pass through the mind. They are not incidental, they are essential. The controlling thought relies on this invisible system, embedding itself into feeling so that questioning it feels risky, uncomfortable, or even impossible. Emotion functions as reinforcement. When a thought coincides with a strong emotional response, the brain records it more deeply. Fear, shame, excitement, desire, these feelings imprint on neural pathways, strengthening associations between the thought and its context. The thought becomes familiar, habitual, and persuasive. It is no longer merely a suggestion. It is a signal backed by the weight of feeling. Repetition amplifies the effect, and over time the thought feels like truth rather than impulse. Consider fear. Fear does not merely accompany a thought. It marks it as urgent. Thoughts linked to fear gain priority in attention. They are rehearsed silently, reflected upon compulsively, and prioritized in decision-making. The controlling thought often leverages fear to enforce compliance, making deviation feel dangerous and familiar patterns feel safe. The emotional charge ensures that the thought is not easily ignored, questioned, or replaced. Pleasure operates similarly but in reverse. Thoughts paired with comfort, reward, or validation are repeated voluntarily. The mind seeks them out. The nervous system learns to anticipate them, creating a feedback loop. The thought produces emotion. The emotion encourages repetition. Repetition reinforces the thought. Over time, the thought feels effortless, inevitable, even desirable. The controlling thought thrives in both fear and comfort, though the mechanisms differ. Fear ensures survival-driven adherence. Pleasure ensures habitual loyalty. Shame and guilt are particularly insidious. They do not simply signal wrongdoing. They mark thoughts as central to identity. A thought linked with guilt tells the brain, "This is important. Pay attention. Avoid error." Repeated enough, it becomes internal law. What began as social conditioning transforms into self-regulation, enforced by emotion. The controlling thought embeds itself into morality, identity, and self-judgment simultaneously. Emotions also create temporal loops. A thought paired with anxiety is rehearsed before, during, and after an event. The brain anticipates threats, replays memories, and projects outcomes. The thought does not merely exist in the moment. It extends across time, reinforced at every stage by corresponding emotion. This creates the illusion of inevitability. It feels as though the thought is predicting reality, when in fact reality is being filtered through a memory and emotion-shaped lens. Subtlety is key. Emotions rarely shout. They whisper, nudge, or tighten. They operate beneath awareness, guiding attention and interpretation. The controlling thought thrives precisely because emotion feels natural, immediate, and inseparable from the self. You rarely distinguish between what is felt and what is thought. The two appear fused. When a thought elicits tension, relief, or expectation, it is often automatically treated as authoritative. This is emotional reinforcement in action. Awareness introduces a quiet rupture. Observing emotional responses without immediate compliance interrupts the reinforcement loop. Noticing that fear, pleasure, or shame is influencing attention allows the thought to be examined as a pattern rather than obeyed as law. This subtle shift does not remove emotion, nor does it erase the thought. It simply reduces automaticity. Repetition continues, but with conscious oversight, weakening the controlling thought's silent authority. Emotions also teach the mind what to anticipate. Repetition of emotional response programs expectation. Anxiety predicts threat. Pleasure predicts reward. Shame predicts judgment. Each anticipation reinforces attention toward familiar patterns, and familiar patterns reinforce the thought. The mind becomes a self-confirming system, interpreting experience through the lens of emotion-backed habits. In this way, emotions function as thought reinforcement systems. They encode priority, validate interpretation, and secure repetition. They make fleeting impulses persistent, ideas authoritative, and habits inevitable. The controlling thought does not merely occupy cognition. It occupies feeling, body, and memory simultaneously. Its authority is both psychological and physiological, subtle and self-perpetuating. The subtle awareness of this process is transformative. By noticing how emotion reinforces thought, you create space between impulse and interpretation, habit and law. the controlling thought remains, but it no longer operates unconsciously. Its authority can be examined, questioned, and gradually redirected. Emotion continues to flow, but you begin to observe it rather than be swept along. The system remains, but freedom reappears. You are often mistaken for the sum of your habits, the repetition of your thoughts, and the cycles of your emotion. What feels like personality is frequently nothing more than a loop, a recurring mental pattern reinforced by memory, attention, and emotion. The controlling thought resides in these loops, not because it is inherently you, but because it has been rehearsed enough to feel inseparable from your identity. Consider how habits form in the mind. A thought arises. An emotion accompanies it. A behavior follows. If repeated, the cycle solidifies. Over time, the same thought triggers the same emotional response and the same behavioral pattern. What was once a choice becomes automatic. It feels effortless, familiar, true. This is how a loop transforms from an event into a presumed essence. Loops are reinforced by internal narrative. The central narrator observes repetition and interprets it as continuity, coherence, or selfhood. I am thoughtful, I am shy, I am anxious. These are not pure truths but summaries of recurring loops. The mind interprets them as inherent qualities, when in fact they are patterns of neural activity, rehearsed enough to feel permanent. The controlling thought relies on this illusion to maintain authority. Once a loop is perceived as personality, it no longer requires attention to sustain itself. It continues automatically, embedded in identity. Emotion is the glue that binds loops. Fear, guilt, pride, or comfort repeatedly accompany certain patterns, giving them weight. A shy child avoids attention. Anxiety follows. The behavior is repeated. Emotion encodes priority. Attention is drawn to confirming experiences. Memory stores the episodes. The loop grows, strengthened at every stage by internal reinforcement. By adulthood, it is no longer behavior. It feels like the self. The loop also explains resistance to change. Trying to alter a habitual thought or behavior triggers tension because it threatens the familiar cycle. The nervous system reacts as if stability is endangered. The controlling thought does not confront you directly. It works through the loop, ensuring repetition feels natural and disruption feels risky. Identity is defended by pattern, and pattern is defended by the subtle authority of emotion and memory. Social reinforcement accelerates the process. Observed behavior produces reactions in others. Approval, disapproval, or attention validates repetition. A compliment for politeness encourages more politeness. A critique for assertiveness discourages deviation. Loops, once socially reinforced, feel even more essential to identity. The controlling thought capitalizes on this reinforcement, embedding itself not only in the mind but also in relational experience. Yet loops are flexible, not immutable. Awareness introduces a subtle but profound rupture. By observing the cycle, thought, emotion, behavior, you can notice the moment the pattern repeats. Recognize the triggers. Notice the habitual interpretation. Identify the automatic attachment of emotion. In that awareness, the loop loses its invisibility. What once felt like personality is revealed as pattern. The controlling thought, dependent on unquestioned repetition, is exposed. This realization does not destroy personality. It refines it. You are not an empty vessel. You are not merely reactive. You are an observer capable of noticing the patterns that were previously automatic. Observation introduces choice. Attention can shift. Emotion can be acknowledged without dictating response. Memory can inform without enforcing the loop. Identity becomes a space of possibility, not a predetermined script. Loops also illustrate the subtlety of control. It is not oppressive, dramatic, or forceful. It does not coerce openly. It operates quietly, invisibly, through repetition and reinforcement. The controlling thought feels natural precisely because it is embedded in familiar cycles. Breaking the loop requires no confrontation, only awareness and gentle redirection. Each noticed repetition weakens authority. Each mindful deviation creates new pathways. The loop you mistake for personality is a framework, not a decree. It is a repeated strategy that once served survival, cohesion, or adaptation. It was reinforced by memory, attention, emotion, and social validation. But once observed, it no longer dictates identity unchallenged. The controlling thought remains, but it becomes negotiable, visible, and ultimately transformable. Awareness is not absent. It is always present, like a faint current beneath the surface of the mind. Yet, Despite its constant presence, it rarely interrupts the controlling thought. Why? Because control does not rely solely on force or coercion. It relies on invisibility, habitual reinforcement, and the subtle scaffolding of memory, attention, and emotion. Awareness can exist without challenging these systems, observing quietly while the patterns persist. The controlling thought operates through automaticity. It embeds itself in loops, in repeated narratives, in emotional reactions. These patterns continue with minimal conscious effort. They require little attention, because they are rehearsed, familiar, and reinforced. Awareness may notice them, but noticing alone is insufficient to break them. Observation, without intervention, allows repetition to continue. The thought feels natural, unquestioned, even inevitable. Attention plays a crucial role. Awareness is limited in bandwidth. It flickers across the landscape of experience, often drawn to novelty, discomfort, or conscious effort. Meanwhile, the controlling thought thrives in habitual zones where attention rarely lingers for long. The mind is efficient. It prioritizes familiar patterns and emotional urgency. Unless attention is intentionally redirected, the loops continue unchallenged. Awareness may sense their existence, but it seldom interrupts them in real time. Emotion further insulates control. Habits linked to fear, guilt, or pleasure are reinforced physiologically. The nervous system responds automatically, guiding thought and behavior along familiar trajectories. Awareness may perceive these responses, but the intensity of emotion can override reflective observation. Anxiety prompts avoidance before noticing occurs. Desire prompts repetition before questioning is possible. In this way, emotion ensures that awareness alone rarely halts control. Memory compounds the effect. Past experiences have trained attention to respond predictably. Familiar cues trigger habitual interpretations, emotional reactions and behaviors. Awareness may perceive the pattern retrospectively, recognizing after the fact that the same thought has repeated, but in the moment, memory-driven prediction dominates perception. The controlling thought benefits from the inertia of encoded experience. Awareness can glimpse the architecture of control, but rarely interferes with its operation mid-loop. Language plays a subtle but critical role. Thoughts framed and named within the internal narrative gain permanence. Awareness can notice the words, the phrasing, the structure, but the brain treats them as familiar scripts. Observing the language does not dismantle the habitual interpretation it invokes. The controlling thought persists because identification is unconscious. Awareness can watch the narrator speak, but the loop continues unbroken until attention, memory, or emotion are intentionally redirected. Even the sense of self protects control. The brain favors continuity and coherence. Awareness is often co-opted to maintain identity, rather than question it. The moment you notice a thought, the mind interprets the noticing as part of the narrative. I am reflective. I am self-aware. This gives the illusion of agency, while the controlling thought continues to operate in the background. Observation is absorbed into the story, neutralizing its disruptive potential. Yet, this does not mean awareness is powerless. It is subtle, cumulative, and patient. Each noticing introduces a micro-gap in habitual repetition. Even if control persists, the loop is slightly less automatic. Repeated observation strengthens attention, weakens unquestioned identification, and opens the possibility for redirection. Awareness rarely interrupts control immediately because it works slowly, quietly, and without force. Its influence is invisible until sufficient repetition allows the system to adjust. The paradox is profound. The more subtle awareness is, the more effective it can eventually become. Control is resilient because it relies on invisibility, repetition, and emotional reinforcement. Awareness is rare in its immediate effect because it does not confront, compel, or demand. But in the long term, its quiet presence destabilizes habitual authority. Observing without reacting introduces friction, and friction slowly erodes automaticity. Ultimately, awareness rarely interrupts control in the moment, but it plants the seed of possibility. The controlling thought may continue to appear dominant, but it now exists in a landscape where observation can intervene, loops can be questioned, and authority can be shifted. Awareness works not by force, but by subtle, patient revelation. It is not immediate liberation. It is the quiet opening through which freedom eventually flows. Control rarely announces itself with force. It wears the guise of necessity, familiarity, or inevitability. But its most potent guardian is fear. Not fear of a loud threat, but subtle, pervasive, almost invisible fear. The quiet anxiety, hesitation, or discomfort that arises whenever a thought is questioned. This fear is the silent sentinel, maintaining authority without effort or visible coercion. From early life, the mind associates certain thoughts with consequence. Deviating from them produces tension, rejection, or shame. Even mild social or emotional disapproval is enough to create a deep neural imprint. Fear encodes the importance of adherence. Thoughts linked to these emotional markers gain protective weight. They are rehearsed, remembered, and defended. Over time, questioning them produces internal alarm, signaling that the thought is essential to survival, identity, or coherence. Fear functions in three key ways. First, it discourages deviation. The moment a dangerous idea arises, a thought that challenges habit, identity, or repetition, fear triggers hesitation. The nervous system stiffens, attention narrows, and mental energy shifts to avoidance or suppression. This ensures that the controlling thought remains unchallenged. Curiosity, doubt, or exploration is experienced as threat. Fear secures compliance without conscious choice. Second, fear amplifies the perceived authority of the thought. A thought paired with anxiety or dread feels urgent and important. The mind interprets intensity as necessity. If the thought triggers discomfort, it must be significant. The controlling thought does not need to justify itself logically. Emotion alone cements its credibility. Repetition of this emotional pairing transforms temporary alarm into persistent internal law. Fear becomes both shield and glue. Third, fear perpetuates repetition. Neural circuits strengthened by emotional response are more likely to activate in the future. Every time the thought reappears, fear marks it again, reinforcing attention, memory, and emotional response. The cycle repeats silently, invisibly, and endlessly. The controlling thought thrives in this loop because its defense is internal, immediate, and automatic. The system protects itself before observation can intervene. This fear is rarely dramatic. It whispers as hesitation, subtle discomfort, or unease. A thought may feel risky without conscious understanding of why. You sense a boundary, a rule, or a restriction. This is the controlling thought's strategy. Avoid overt imposition. Subtlety ensures compliance while reducing resistance. You obey because resistance feels threatening, even when the threat exists only in anticipation. Language and memory reinforce fear's authority. Phrases like "I shouldn't," "I can't," "I must" encode restriction. Memories of prior hesitation, rejection, or discomfort are recalled automatically. Emotion colors, recollection, and memory validates the warning. Questioning is dangerous. The thought is shielded from challenge by an invisible web woven from past experiences, internal narrative, and emotional anticipation. Social cues amplify the process. External judgment, expectation, or criticism triggers internal fear responses. Even imagining disapproval produces the same subtle nervous tension that guards the thought. The controlling thought is never solitary. It operates in a feedback loop involving body, mind, memory, and environment. Fear is the silent conduit linking these systems, ensuring that challenge feels costly. Yet fear is not immutable. Awareness introduces a gap. By noticing the sensation of tension, hesitation, or dread, you recognize its origin. The alarm becomes visible, not automatic. Observation weakens compulsion. Repeated awareness teaches the nervous system that deviation is possible without catastrophe. The controlling thought remains, but its invisible sentinel is exposed. Fear still arises, but it no longer dictates obedience. This subtle recognition transforms relationship with thought. Fear is no longer unquestionable authority. It becomes a signal to notice rather than a command to obey. The controlling thought may persist, but the nervous system begins to learn flexibility. Observation without reaction is the first disruption of its silent dominion. Fear guards the thought, not through violence, but through invisibility and habitual reaction. It convinces the mind that the familiar is necessary, the questioned is dangerous, and compliance is survival. Yet, with patient awareness, the sentinel can be glimpsed, named, and circumnavigated. Control remains, but it no longer rules unobserved. Sleep is often perceived as passive, a time when the body rests, the mind drifts, and consciousness fades. Yet sleep is one of the controlling thought's quietest allies. While you are unaware, memory, emotion, and neural patterns are reinforced. Loops consolidate, emotional weight is encoded. The authority of repeated thoughts, habitual narratives, and identity-linked patterns grows stronger while vigilance is suspended. During sleep, The brain processes experiences of the day, events are filtered, priorities established, and memory networks strengthened. The controlling thought exploits this natural process. Repeated thoughts, particularly those tied to emotion or habit, are replayed internally during dreaming and non-dreaming stages. Neural circuits associated with these thoughts are reinforced, making them more likely to dominate attention when awake. Sleep is less rest and more rehearsal. The emotional components of thoughts are particularly reinforced during sleep. Fear, pleasure, and shame are encoded into the same circuits that store memory. A thought tied to subtle anxiety during waking hours is replayed during sleep in ways that strengthen its influence over attention, perception, and automatic responses. By morning, the thought appears even more natural, familiar, and inseparable from identity. What felt optional yesterday now feels inevitable today. Sleep also consolidates patterns of prediction. The brain simulates scenarios, anticipates outcomes, and rehearses responses to familiar stimuli. Thoughts that align with habitual reactions gain priority in these simulations. The controlling thought is thus rehearsed internally without conscious attention. Its authority is silently affirmed. Even dreams, often strange and fluid, frequently echo habitual loops, subtly reinforcing the perceived inevitability of certain patterns and decisions. Memory replay during sleep is selective. Experiences that support identity, habit, or familiar narrative loops are strengthened, while contradictory or novel experiences are less likely to be encoded with equal authority. This selection is not deliberate but automatic. The controlling thought benefits because sleep functions as an amplifier. It is the mind's nightly endorsement of repetition, making the familiar appear foundational and the habitual appear essential. Language and internal narrative also gain reinforcement in subtle ways. Thoughts that are frequently verbalized or rehearsed in waking life are likely to recur during dreaming stages. Phrases, internal scripts, and habitual interpretations are replayed alongside emotional and sensory details. By morning, these patterns feel more structured, coherent, and authoritative. Sleep quietly edits the narrative to favor repetition over novelty, continuity over exploration. Subconscious processing during sleep also increases accessibility of habitual thoughts. Neural pathways that were weak during the day become easier to activate upon waking. The controlling thought feels more automatic, effortless, and intuitive. You are unaware of the nightly rehearsal, yet the morning experience feels natural, as though certain ideas have always been central to your identity. Sleep strengthens authority precisely by operating invisibly. This effect explains why new insights or conscious intentions often falter. Efforts to change thought patterns during waking hours are repeatedly counteracted by the reinforced authority encoded during sleep. The controlling thought, rehearsed subconsciously, returns with renewed strength. Change is not impossible, but awareness alone is insufficient unless it is sustained across cycles, including the subtle nocturnal reinforcement. Awareness of this mechanism is itself transformative. Observing how sleep contributes to the persistence of repeated thoughts introduces a subtle gap between the observer and the narrative. You begin to see that authority is not absolute. It is rehearsed, repeated, and reinforced. The controlling thought is powerful, but it is not unchallengeable. Awareness extends into the nocturnal process, transforming understanding into subtle leverage. Sleep, then, is both a rehearsal stage and a consolidator of mental authority. The controlling thought does not need to act while awake. It is silently strengthened each night through memory, emotion, and rehearsal. By noticing this process, awareness begins to reclaim influence, observing reinforcement without being fully bound by it. Sleep remains necessary and beneficial, but it is no longer a silent enforcer. Its role becomes visible, its power negotiable, and its effect subject to subtle intervention. Reality feels immediate, undeniable, and self-evident. You wake, you see, you hear, you feel, and the world appears as it is. Yet beneath this apparent certainty lies a subtle arbiter, the controlling thought that decides what feels real. It does not announce itself. It does not dictate in overt terms. Instead, it quietly shapes perception, filters experience, and grants authority to some sensations, while dismissing others. What you accept as real is heavily curated. The process begins with attention. The mind is constantly bombarded with sensory input, sights, sounds, smells, textures, and internal states. Attention selects a fraction of this stream to process. The controlling thought influences this selection, guiding notice toward familiar, repeated, or emotionally charged patterns. These are deemed meaningful. Everything else fades into the background. Reality, then, is not a raw experience. It is a filtered construct, heavily biased by the repeated, reinforced and emotionally validated thought. Memory reinforces this construct. Past experiences are recalled to interpret present input. What has been noticed before is more likely to be noticed again. What was emotionally significant before is amplified in perception. This feedback loop ensures that the thought maintains consistency and authority over what is considered real. Sensory data is rarely neutral. It is interpreted through layers of rehearsal, repetition, and expectation. Reality feels coherent because the controlling thought organizes it to appear so. Emotion adds weight to perceived reality. Fear, comfort, curiosity, or desire color sensory experience, making some events vivid and others invisible. A threatening thought produces immediate focus. A pleasurable pattern enhances selective attention. The controlling thought embeds itself in emotional resonance, ensuring that the mind prioritizes input that confirms habitual narratives. The world feels as it should, not as it objectively is. Feeling real is equated with being significant, familiar, or coherent. Language further solidifies reality. Labels, internal narration, and descriptive concepts give permanence to fleeting perceptions. By naming and describing experience, the thought assigns credibility. A sensation becomes a fear, a loss, a success, a failure. Once categorized, the experience is encoded into memory and integrated into identity. The controlling thought uses language as scaffolding, turning momentary impressions into enduring reality. What is named and repeated feels undeniably true. The subtlety of this process is critical. The controlling thought does not need to dominate overtly. Its authority is established through habituation, reinforcement, and alignment with survival, identity, and expectation. You are rarely aware of this curation, because it feels natural. The mind assumes that attention, memory, emotion, and language are impartial conduits to truth, when in fact they are the tools of the invisible arbiter. Reality, then, is not discovered. It is continuously constructed. This explains why two people can witness the same event, yet perceive it entirely differently. One's controlling thoughts, emotional history, and narrative loops filter and prioritize sensory data uniquely. Reality is subjective, not because perception is faulty, but because authority over what feels real resides in a thought shaped by repetition, emotion, and experience. What is noticed, remembered, and emotionally reinforced becomes truth in the mind's experiential world. Awareness is the only counterbalance. Observing how attention is guided, noticing emotional weighting, questioning habitual interpretations, and recognizing narrative scaffolding introduces a subtle distance between perception and judgment. The controlling thought remains, but its authority over what is accepted as real is no longer absolute. You begin to see that reality is not fixed, but curated, not inevitable, but patterned, not self-evident, but constructed. Freedom arises in this space of observation. The thought that decides what feels real is no longer invisible. You can notice its filters, question its authority, and expand perception beyond habitual patterns. Experience itself becomes negotiable. Sensory input continues, memory continues, emotion continues, but their role in defining reality shifts from unquestioned dictator to participant in conscious choice. Reality is no longer merely accepted. It is observed, interpreted, and gently reshaped. Silence is rarely neutral. It is an absence of external stimulation, a pause in the constant chatter of mind and world. Yet for most, silence initially feels uncomfortable, even threatening. The controlling thought thrives in this discomfort. It uses silence as a mirror, reflecting internal patterns that are usually masked by distraction, noise, and habitual attention. In this space, the thought's authority becomes more evident, yet the mind instinctively resists noticing it. Discomfort arises because silence removes the familiar scaffolding of attention. During everyday activity, attention is guided outward. Screens, conversation, movement, or repetitive tasks fill the space and provide structure. These external anchors distract from internal loops, habitual narratives, and emotional resonance. Silence strips away the noise, leaving attention facing the internal landscape unshielded. Patterns previously unnoticed suddenly become apparent. The mind reacts with tension, labeling this exposure as danger or anxiety. Emotion plays a critical role in amplifying initial discomfort. Fear, boredom, or restlessness emerges when habitual distraction is removed. The nervous system interprets the sudden openness as uncertainty, predictable repetition. The loops that support identity and the controlling thought is temporarily suspended. The mind experiences this suspension as instability. The subtle fear that surfaces in silence is not arbitrary. It is the mind's signal that habitual authority is momentarily unchallenged and visible. Memory reinforces this discomfort. From early life, silence often coincides with reflection, waiting, or anticipation of judgment. Children are conditioned to fill quiet moments with activity or thought conformity. Over time, the brain encodes silence as a space of tension, a pause that requires mental management. When stillness arises in adulthood, memory replays associations of discomfort, anxiety, or self-consciousness. The mind reacts before conscious observation occurs, reinforcing the feeling that silence is challenging or even threatening. Language and internal narration intensify the effect. In silence, internal dialogue becomes louder. By contrast, thoughts that normally operate in the background are suddenly foregrounded. Self-judgment, planning, regret, or anxiety become conspicuous. The controlling thought takes advantage of this amplification. Patterns that usually operate invisibly now assert themselves, subtly reminding you of habitual interpretation, familiar fears, and automatic loops. The mind interprets this exposure as instability rather than observation. The initial discomfort is thus a defensive mechanism. It protects habitual authority. Silence exposes loops, habitual attention, and emotional waiting, threatening the illusion of effortless identity. Avoiding or filling silence ensures that the controlling thought remains invisible and unchallenged. Even subtle distractions, checking a phone, speaking aloud, or moving, serve to maintain the familiar scaffolding. Discomfort encourages compliance with repetition, discouraging observation and reflection. Yet this discomfort is temporary. With continued exposure, silence becomes a revealing ally rather than a threat. Attention begins to notice patterns without immediate reaction. Emotional tension is observed rather than obeyed. Memory-driven assumptions lose their grip. The controlling thought remains present, but its authority is softened. Silence transforms from a source of anxiety into a space of insight, reflection, and subtle autonomy. The paradox of silence is essential to understanding control. What initially feels threatening is in fact the mind's opportunity to observe itself. Discomfort signals the temporary suspension of habitual reinforcement. Awareness emerges most clearly in this gap. The controlling thought may persist, but it can no longer operate entirely unnoticed. Observation begins, patterns become visible, and the illusion of effortless control is quietly exposed. In this way, silence is both mirror and doorway. It reflects habitual authority, yet simultaneously allows distance and insight. The mind experiences initial discomfort, precisely because control is being observed, even if unconsciously. Continued exposure transforms tension into understanding. The controlling thought remains, but it is no longer absolute. Silence, once feared, becomes the subtle stage where observation, reflection, and eventual freedom can emerge. Thoughts, even the controlling ones, are not eternal. Like currents in a river, they ebb and flow, gaining strength through repetition and reinforcement, weakening when their supporting systems falter. Yet the weakening of a thought is subtle, almost imperceptible. It does not vanish dramatically or announce itself with fanfare. Instead, it loses authority quietly, imperceptibly shifting from unquestioned ruler to one voice among many, visible and negotiable. The weakening begins when habitual reinforcement falters. Repetition, memory, and emotional association are the pillars of thought authority. When these mechanisms are disrupted, by attention that observes without reacting, by emotional awareness that notes tension without obeying, or by novel experiences that contradict habitual patterns, the thought loses some of its automatic strength. What once felt inevitable now feels less compulsory, less self-evident. Observation is a critical factor. Awareness does not destroy the thought, but it introduces friction into its operation. Repeated, noticing interrupts automatic loops, creating micro-gaps between stimulus and response. The nervous system, accustomed to automatic compliance, begins to detect unpredictability. Repetition alone is insufficient to restore authority when attention consistently witnesses the thought without immediate obedience. Each instance of observation weakens its silent grip. Emotion also participates in the weakening process. When a controlling thought no longer elicits its usual intensity of fear, shame, or desire, its authority diminishes. Emotional reinforcement is not erased, but it becomes conditional rather than absolute. Anxiety may still arise, but awareness allows recognition without surrender. Comfort may still entice, but the mind can observe pleasure without full compliance. When emotion loses its unquestioned allegiance, the thought's perceived inevitability erodes. Memory too plays a role. The controlling thought relies on recollection of past repetitions to justify present authority. But when memory is reinterpreted, when prior patterns are observed, questioned or reframed, the historical scaffolding weakens. The mind begins to notice inconsistencies, loops that were previously unchallenged, emotional reactions that were once automatic, interpretations that were assumed necessary. The thought no longer appears as coherent, absolute, or invulnerable. Language and internal narrative can either reinforce or erode authority. Habits of labeling, categorizing, and interpreting experience often maintain the controlling thought. Yet, when phrases are observed, questioned, or replaced, the scaffolding loses rigidity. Saying "I feel anxious" is not inherently reinforcing. What matters is whether the observer attaches unquestioned belief or allows noticing to coexist. Words lose their power when attention no longer confuses repetition for truth. The weakening is gradual. It is neither linear nor uniform. Some aspects of the thought may lose strength quickly, while others persist. Habitual patterns, deeply reinforced by emotion or social feedback, may remain stubborn. Yet subtle gaps accumulate. Loops become observable. Tension is noted without automatic reaction. Predictable attention shifts. The controlling thought, once invisible, becomes partially transparent. Authority is no longer absolute. It can be questioned, interrupted, and redirected. This process demonstrates that control is not invincible. Its strength lies in invisibility and automaticity. When these qualities are compromised through repeated awareness, emotional recognition, and reinterpreted memory, the thought's dominance diminishes. What was once accepted as natural, necessary, and inevitable becomes negotiable. Freedom emerges not through force, but through patient observation and subtle disruption of habitual reinforcement. Even as the thought weakens, it often resists passively. Its influence remains present, but it no longer dictates experience with unquestioned authority. Recognition allows choice. The mind becomes capable of observing, without surrendering, experiencing without immediate interpretation, and noticing patterns without being trapped by them. The thought remains, but it is no longer master. It is visible, comprehensible, and ultimately, transformable. In this subtle erosion, awareness reveals its potency. The controlling thought is not annihilated, but it becomes a participant in a conscious dialogue rather than an automatic dictator. What once shaped perception, memory, and emotion invisibly now coexists with observation, choice, and reflection. Weakening is not failure, it is liberation in progress, a quiet shift in the balance of internal authority that opens the mind to presence, curiosity, and subtle freedom. There have been moments, brief, fragile, easily dismissed moments where the controlling thought loosened its grip. They did not arrive with clarity or announcement. They appeared quietly, often disguised as confusion, stillness, or an unexpected calm. You may not have recognized them at the time, but they were there. Gaps in the loop, cracks in the authority. These moments often occur when the usual patterns fail to activate. A familiar trigger appears, yet the expected reaction does not follow immediately. There is a pause, a breath, a fraction of a second where the thought hesitates. In that hesitation, control weakens. The mind does not know what to do next. This uncertainty feels strange, even uncomfortable, because it interrupts continuity, but it is also the closest you come to freedom without realizing it. Sometimes these moments arrive during exhaustion, when the mind is too tired to rehearse its usual scripts. The controlling thought loses momentum, emotional responses soften, attention drifts without fixation. You may feel detached, distant, or oddly neutral. The world continues, but the internal narrator falters. The thought that usually defines meaning struggles to assert itself. For a brief interval, experience exists without commentary. Other times these moments appear during awe or absorption. A sunset, music, deep focus, or unexpected beauty pulls attention fully into the present. The controlling thought recedes, not because it is challenged, but because attention is elsewhere. There is no internal debate, no reinforcement loop. Just perception, just experience. When the moment passes, the thought returns, but something lingers, a subtle memory of what it felt like to be ungoverned. Emotional disruption can also create these openings. Grief, shock, or intense joy, temporarily disorganize habitual patterns. The familiar interpretations no longer fit. The controlling thought attempts to reassert meaning, but its framework feels insufficient. In this destabilization, awareness briefly emerges. You may feel lost, disoriented, or strangely open. These are not failures of control. They are moments where the system is visible. Silence plays a role here as well. In quiet moments, when distraction fades and attention has nowhere habitual to land, the thought becomes noticeable rather than authoritative. You may feel restless or uneasy, compelled to fill the space. But if the urge is not immediately obeyed, a gap appears. In that gap, you almost escape, not permanently, not dramatically, but enough to glimpse the machinery. These moments are fleeting, because the mind is efficient. It restores order quickly. The controlling thought rushes back to explain, interpret, and stabilize. It reframes the experience as fatigue, distraction, coincidence, or emotional fluctuation. The gap is closed. Normality resumes. The illusion of uninterrupted control is restored, and yet something subtle has changed. Memory does not record these moments clearly. They lack narrative structure. They do not fit neatly into identity. As a result, they are often forgotten or minimized. But the nervous system remembers. The mind remembers. Somewhere beneath conscious recall, there is recognition that the loop is not absolute. That escape, however brief, is possible. These moments matter, not because they free you instantly, but because they prove something fundamental. The controlling thought is not omnipotent. It depends on repetition, attention, and emotional reinforcement. When any of these falter, authority weakens, even briefly, even quietly. You almost escaped it more times than you realize. Each pause, each unexpected calm, each moment of presence without narrative was a glimpse beyond the loop. Not a destination, not an awakening, just a crack, and cracks are enough. They show that control is maintained, not guaranteed, that authority is rehearsed, not inherent, that what feels permanent is actually sustained moment by moment. These realizations do not overthrow the system, but they destabilize certainty. They introduce doubt into inevitability, and doubt, when observed rather than suppressed, becomes the seed of transformation. The loop is a quiet enforcer. It repeats, reinforces, and sustains the controlling thought. It feels like continuity, coherence, even identity. But loops are not indestructible. They can break, subtly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. When they do, the experience is unlike any dramatic revelation you might expect. It is disorienting, unfamiliar, and strangely liberating. Reality itself feels slightly rearranged, because the framework that once filtered perception has faltered. Breaking a loop begins with interruption. Repetition is the lifeblood of habitual authority. When attention is diverted, emotion unanchored, or memory reframed, the pattern cannot complete its cycle. The usual sequence, thought, emotion, interpretation, reaction, stalls. A pause emerges. In this pause, the controlling thought's authority diminishes. What once felt inevitable becomes negotiable. What once seemed inseparable from identity is revealed as constructed, fragile, and conditional. The immediate experience can be unsettling. The mind expects continuity. It expects repetition. Without the familiar scaffolding, attention drifts into uncertainty. Emotional responses may feel mismatched or muted. The internal narrator, accustomed to interpreting and guiding experience, hesitates. A strange openness arises. Sensation exists without immediate categorization. Thought exists without unquestioned allegiance. The gap is disorienting precisely because control is so habitual. Yet within this disorientation lies possibility. The mind is no longer constrained by the predictable loop. Novel connections can form. Attention can explore without immediate judgment. Emotions can arise without automatic interpretation. Memory can inform without enforcing pattern. The breakdown of habitual repetition allows raw experience, slightly unfiltered, slightly untamed, to enter consciousness. This is not chaos. It is potential, a subtle expansion of perceptual and cognitive space. Breaking the loop also exposes the controlling thought. What seemed natural and unavoidable is revealed as patterned, rehearsed, and reinforced. The illusion of identity tied to repetition falters. The thought is no longer invisible. It is visible, comprehensible, and negotiable. Observation gains power. Awareness, previously subtle and tentative, can now operate without immediate suppression. The once dominant pattern becomes one among many, susceptible to influence, redirection, or even abandonment. Emotion responds to the break. Fear, discomfort, or anxiety may arise, signaling the mind's recognition of instability. These feelings are not arbitrary. They are the nervous system's response to the temporary suspension of habitual control. Yet, they are also indicators of change. Discomfort marks the boundaries of previously unquestioned authority. By observing rather than reacting, awareness begins to consolidate the transformation initiated by the break. Memory plays a reinforcing role here. Once the loop breaks, recollection of past repetitions shifts. Experiences previously interpreted as inevitable now appear contingent. Patterns that once seemed permanent reveal themselves as conditional, context-dependent, and flexible. The mind begins to see history not as a script, but as a collection of moments, some repeated, some arbitrary, some reinforcing, some incidental. The controlling thought, once anchored in perceived continuity, loses coherence. The break is rarely absolute. Loops may reform, familiar patterns may reassert themselves, and control may temporarily regain strength. Yet, each rupture leaves a trace, a subtle instability, a slightly loosened grip, a perceptible possibility. Repetition becomes negotiable. Authority is no longer invisible. Awareness has entered the system, creating friction that slows automaticity and introduces choice. The psychological significance of a loop breaking lies in this subtle liberation. It demonstrates that authority is contingent, perception is curated, and identity is partially constructed. Control is not a force of nature. It is maintained through repetition, emotion, attention, and memory. When these pillars are disrupted, even briefly, freedom becomes perceptible. The mind experiences a shift, not in overt power, but in the quiet expansion of possibility. In this space, observation transforms into agency. The loop no longer dictates experience unchallenged. Awareness is no longer passive. Choices, interpretations, and perceptions gain room to manifest outside habitual enforcement. What happens when the loop breaks is not an explosion, but a gentle revelation. Authority can falter, patterns can shift, and the controlling thought, once absolute, is now negotiable. There is a calm that follows the weakening of authority, the brief rupture of repetition, or the subtle fracture of the controlling thought. It is not immediate serenity, nor is it an ecstatic liberation. It is strange, unfamiliar, almost eerie in its quietude. The loops no longer hum insistently. The internal narrator is subdued. Attention drifts freely. Emotion exists without immediate command. In this calm, experience feels unstructured, open, and profoundly different from the habitual flow of daily life. This calm is difficult to describe because it lacks the usual markers of identity. The mind is accustomed to labeling, judging, and predicting. When authority loosens, these scaffolds falter. There is no immediate urge to react, no internal commentary demanding evaluation, no automatic reinforcement of habitual patterns. Sensation exists as raw data. Perception unfolds without the usual filter, and time is experienced with subtle expansiveness. What once felt essential, the guiding thought, the habitual loops, no longer dictates immediacy. Silence is a major component of this experience. When the mind is not constantly rehearsing, reacting, or reinforcing, there is space for observation without interference. Internal chatter softens. Emotional urgency diminishes. Memory does not impose narrative. In this quiet, the mind perceives itself not as the sum of repeated patterns, but as a space in which perception, thought, and feeling coexist without compulsion. The strange calm is a threshold, the point where habitual authority recedes enough for awareness to operate freely. Emotion in this calm is paradoxical. The tension that once accompanied control is absent, but so is the familiar excitement of engagement. Anxiety diminishes, but so does compulsive desire. Pleasure and fear exist, but without automatic amplification. This neutrality is unsettling precisely because it is rare. The mind interprets absence of compulsion as emptiness or void, yet it is not emptiness. It is presence without interference, awareness without the pressure of habitual loops, and sensation without predetermined significance. Perception changes in this calm. Ordinary events appear vivid in subtle ways. A breeze on the skin, sunlight on a surface, or the sound of distant movement becomes more noticeable because attention is no longer hijacked by repetition. The controlling thought, which once decided what was relevant, now observes alongside you rather than dictating experience. Reality itself feels slightly expanded. The mind experiences a quiet clarity, a a subtle but undeniable flexibility in interpretation. Time, too, behaves differently. Moments are not immediately categorized as past, present, or predictive future. Each experience can linger longer than usual because habitual sequencing is loosened. Awareness is not constrained by urgency. Emotional and cognitive cycles pause, allowing reflection, observation, and gentle curiosity to flourish. The strange calm is not static. It is a dynamic stillness, an active suspension of automatic enforcement. This state is rare because habitual authority is resilient. Repetition, emotion, memory, and internal narrative usually reassert themselves quickly. The calm is often interrupted by familiar loops returning, familiar narratives imposing continuity, or subtle fear nudging attention back to habitual patterns. Yet even fleeting, the calm demonstrates the mind's capacity to experience without domination. It is proof that authority is conditional and freedom is not impossible. Awareness is the key to sustaining this calm. By observing without judgment, by noticing without reacting, the mind gradually lengthens the intervals between compulsive loops. Repetition is not eliminated, but its dominance is reduced. Emotional urgency is softened. Attention gains flexibility. In this space, control is no longer the default. The calm is not an escape from reality. It is a glimpse of the mind operating with subtle autonomy, free from habitual dictation, yet fully present. The strange calm beyond mental control is not the absence of thought, nor the suppression of emotion. It is the space where loops pause, authority recedes, and observation becomes primary. In this state, the mind is both present and untethered, experiencing sensation, reflection, and perception without the automatic reinforcement of familiar patterns. It is an unfamiliar serenity, fragile yet profoundly revealing, offering insight into the possibility of conscious freedom within the machinery of the mind. Even after weakening, after momentary pauses, or following subtle ruptures, the controlling thought rarely disappears entirely. It will try to return. Its persistence is not accidental. Authority, once established, is maintained through repetition, emotional reinforcement, memory, and habit. The thought is a survivor, a silent organizer, and it is designed to reassert itself whenever its continuity is threatened. Understanding why it returns reveals the mechanisms of mental control and the resilience of habitual authority. At its core, the thought is reinforced by repetition. Neural pathways established through countless iterations carry momentum. Even when attention observes without reacting, the circuits remain intact, ready to fire. A brief lapse in control does not erase patterns. It merely exposes the gap. The thought remembers its territory. When the mind encounters familiar stimuli, emotion, or memory triggers, these pathways reactivate automatically. Return is the natural consequence of ingrained rehearsal. Emotion strengthens this comeback. Thoughts associated with fear, comfort, desire, or guilt leave traces in the nervous system. These emotional imprints act like magnets, drawing attention back to familiar loops. Even when awareness momentarily weakens the thought's authority, emotional intensity reminds the mind of its prior significance. The urge to obey or rehearse is subtle but compelling. Emotions act as silent enforcers, signaling that the thought is essential to survival, coherence, or identity, even if it is no longer fully unquestioned. Memory amplifies persistence. The controlling thought is anchored in recollection, experiences, lessons, and interpretations accumulated over time. Memory does not forget easily. It recalls prior compliance, reinforcing the sense of necessity. Even fleeting lapses are corrected by recollection of prior repetitions. The mind relies on these recollections to maintain continuity, ensuring that the thought reasserts itself. Return is less a deliberate effort, and more an automatic consequence of the brain's design to preserve coherence and predictability. Habit also plays a subtle but crucial role. Patterns of attention, response, and interpretation are rehearsed countless times. The mind anticipates triggers and preemptively activates familiar loops. Even without conscious thought, habitual reactions draw attention back to the controlling pattern. The system is designed to stabilize itself. When gaps appear, habit restores equilibrium. The thought tries to return not as an intruder, but as a homeostatic mechanism maintaining familiar order. Even awareness itself paradoxically encourages return. Noticing the thought introduces tension, curiosity, or subtle expectation. The mind observes the gap and interprets it as anomaly, generating subtle pressure to restore equilibrium. Observation does not automatically dissolve patterns. It only opens the possibility of change. The thought exploits this attention, reasserting itself through familiarity, emotional resonance, and automatic expectation. External cues reinforce the comeback. Social feedback, environmental patterns, and cultural norms all provide signals that validate habitual interpretation. A word, a gesture, a familiar situation can reignite attention and emotional alignment with the controlling thought. Return is rarely dramatic. It is a gentle, almost invisible realignment. The thought quietly resumes its role as arbiter, re-establishing authority with minimal disturbance to consciousness. Yet this persistence is not invincible. Awareness, repetition of observation, and emotional recognition weaken return over time. Each interruption introduces friction, reduces automaticity, and diminishes unquestioned authority. The thought will attempt to return, but with consistent noticing, gaps lengthen and influence diminishes. Return becomes less compelling, less automatic, less absolute. Authority is no longer invisible. It is negotiable, visible, and open to subtle intervention. The return of the thought demonstrates its design, not its inevitability. It survives through memory, repetition, emotion, and habit, seeking to maintain coherence and identity. Yet persistence does not equal permanence. Observation introduces subtle disruption. Attention, awareness, and reflection create space for choice, even as habitual authority nudges back. Understanding why the thought returns is the first step in noticing, negotiating, and gradually weakening its imperious hold. Even as it tries to return, the thought is no longer absolute. Each attempt can be observed, each loop can be questioned, each emotional cue can be noted. Return is a predictable rhythm, but one that now occurs in a landscape where awareness has gained influence. The controlling thought survives, but it no longer dominates unchallenged. Its reassertion is now part of conscious observation rather than invisible authority, revealing both resilience and vulnerability in the patterns that shape your mind. For most of life, the mind relies on a central thought, a controlling pattern that organizes perception, attention, and emotion. It is the silent arbiter, the internal narrator, the invisible rule maker. But what happens when this central thought is no longer dominant, weakened, or even temporarily absent? Living without a central thought is strange, disorienting, yet quietly liberating. It is not a dramatic release. It is a subtle reorientation, a reweaving of consciousness without a singular anchor. At first, the absence feels unsettling. Habitual loops that once guided attention falter. Familiar interpretations lose immediacy. Emotional responses appear muted or inconsistent. Without the central thought dictating relevance, experience feels unstructured. The mind notices more freely, yet lacks the organizing principle it has long depended upon. Freedom, paradoxically, is experienced as instability. Reality feels less certain, less predictable, less owned by familiar patterns. Attention, usually guided by the central thought, begins to drift. Sights, sounds, and internal sensations compete for awareness without automatic prioritization. The mind perceives without immediately interpreting, evaluates without rehearsing predetermined reactions. In the absence of habitual authority, perception becomes more direct, raw, and nuanced. What previously seemed trivial or unnoticed now gains clarity. Familiar objects, moments, and interactions acquire new significance because they are observed without preconception. Emotion behaves differently in this state, without the central thought reinforcing fear, desire, or attachment. Feelings are experienced with less compulsion. Anxiety may arise, but it is observed rather than obeyed. Joy is present, yet it does not demand repetition or affirmation. The absence of authority allows emotional currents to exist without immediate narrative framing. Reactions are more fluid, less rehearsed, and subtly liberated from the weight of habitual loops. Memory shifts in subtle ways. Recollection no longer enforces the authority of repetition or identity. Past experiences are recalled as reference points, rather than obligatory templates. Without a central thought filtering relevance, events are interpreted with fresh nuance. Patterns previously deemed essential may appear contingent. Past anxieties may lose urgency. Familiar habits may lose necessity. Memory becomes more descriptive than prescriptive, enriching experience without imposing it. Internal dialogue changes as well. The constant commentary that once interpreted, judged, and reinforced the central thought diminishes. Observation takes precedence over narration. The mind notices patterns, sensations, and reactions without immediately categorizing or reacting. Thoughts exist alongside awareness, no longer dictating attention or action. Silence becomes accessible, and mental space is freed from habitual enforcement. Living without a central thought is not permanent by default. Habitual authority often attempts to reassert itself, nudging attention back to familiar patterns and interpretations. Yet even temporary absence reveals something essential. Experience is not entirely dependent on control. The mind can operate without a singular organizing force. Awareness can guide attention, perception, and emotion in ways that are flexible, fluid, and negotiable. This absence introduces subtle autonomy. Paradoxically, the absence of a central thought can deepen connection to the present. Without the habitual narrative enforcing priority, attention attends more fully to immediate sensation and perception. Experience is no longer entirely filtered, rehearsed, or anticipated. The mind begins to inhabit moments directly, rather than through the lens of habitual authority. Reality feels larger, more varied, and more participatory. Freedom in this context is quiet, incremental, and often subtle. It is not a dramatic liberation or an explosion of insight. It is the soft realization that experience can unfold without rigid authority, that perception can be fluid, that emotion can be observed, and that thought can exist without dictating existence. Living without a central thought does not erase patterns. It simply allows space for awareness to operate alongside them, creating a mind that is present, flexible, and partially autonomous. Ultimately, the absence of a central thought illuminates possibility. Authority is conditional, perception is curated, and identity is partially constructed. Without its dominance, awareness gains subtle influence. The mind experiences space, observation, and choice. The central thought may return, may attempt to reassert itself, but life without it proves that mental authority is negotiable, not absolute, and that presence can exist without rehearsal. At the end of the journey, after observing, questioning, and experiencing the subtle influence of the controlling thought, there comes a moment of realization. It is neither dramatic nor loud. It does not arrive with fanfare or epiphany. It is quiet, almost imperceptible, a gentle clarity that settles across the landscape of awareness. This is the final realization. The controlling thought is not invincible, yet it persists. It shapes perception, yet is conditional. It defines identity, yet is negotiable. It changes nothing, and everything. The paradox of this insight is its subtlety. Nothing outward necessarily shifts. The routines of life, the external circumstances, and the behaviors that once felt automatic may continue largely unchanged. The mind may still wake to habitual loops, the environment may continue to impose familiar patterns, and emotion may still tug with familiar insistence. The controlling thought remains present, often attempting to resume authority. In terms of daily mechanics, little appears to have altered. Yet, internally, everything has shifted. Observation now operates with recognition. Attention can witness without immediate compliance. Emotional responses can be observed without automatic reinforcement. Memory can be recalled without unquestioned interpretation. The controlling thought is no longer invisible. Its authority is negotiable. Each moment carries the subtle knowledge that what once felt inevitable is conditional, rehearsed, and partially constructed. The realization is quiet but foundational. This understanding introduces freedom without resistance. The mind no longer unconsciously obeys. Patterns continue, yet they coexist with awareness. Loops recur, yet each recurrence is now observed, not automatically reinforced. Emotional intensities still arise, yet their hold is softened by attention. The controlling thought is present, yet it no longer dictates perception entirely. In this coexistence lies a subtle autonomy, a liberation that does not require dramatic overthrow or rebellion. The realization also dissolves urgency. Previously, the mind operated under invisible compulsion to respond, to interpret, to reinforce loops. Now, there is recognition that immediate reaction is optional. Experience can unfold with patience and observation. Decisions, emotional responses, and attention can be negotiated rather than automatically directed. The mind gains subtle spaciousness, a quiet breathing room between stimulus and response. Control is not erased, it is rendered negotiable. Ironically, this is why the realization changes everything while changing nothing. Outwardly, life may continue along the same patterns. Internally, the foundation of authority has shifted. Observation and awareness have gained persistent influence. The controlling thought is no longer absolute. Familiarity no longer equals inevitability. What once defined reality identity, and perception now exists as a participant in consciousness rather than its ruler. The mind is, for the first time, subtly free even amidst habitual structure. The realization is not an achievement. It is recognition. There is no end point, no permanent liberation, no final emancipation. Loops will return, habits will reassert, and the mind will continue to follow familiar patterns. Yet the observer has emerged within the system. Awareness can coexist with authority, observation can coexist with habitual interpretation, and choice can coexist with compulsion. The mind experiences the world with subtle autonomy, even while patterns persist. This final insight also reframes patience, humility, and acceptance. Freedom is not instantaneous or absolute. Transformation is incremental. Each moment of observation is a small rupture in repetition. Each gap of attention weakens automatic authority. Each emotional recognition softens reinforcement. Change is neither immediate nor dramatic. It is woven into the quiet acknowledgement of reality's conditional nature. Ultimately, the final realization teaches that control is negotiable, authority is conditional, and awareness is subtly transformative. Nothing outwardly may appear altered, yet internally, everything has shifted. The mind observes itself, participates consciously, and experiences subtle autonomy. The thought that once seemed absolute is now visible, flexible, and accountable. You have not escaped it entirely, nor have you surrendered to it completely. In that paradox lies the quiet, profound freedom that defines the mind beyond habitual control. You have traced the hidden architecture of thought, moving from its invisible beginnings to the final realization of its subtle authority. Throughout these sections, the controlling thought has revealed itself as both omnipresent and fragile, shaping attention, emotion, memory, and perception without ever announcing its presence. It has guided you, constrained you, and even defined the rhythm of experience. Yet it is neither eternal nor invincible. What seems absolute is, in truth, a pattern sustained by repetition, reinforced by emotion, and legitimized by habit. By observing these patterns, you discovered the micro moments where control faltered, the hesitation in a loop, the gap in attention, the quiet pause in emotion. You saw how repetition turns thought into law, how memory decides what is noticed, and how language locks perception into place. You witnessed the loops mistaken for personality, the fear that guards habitual authority, and the strange calm that emerges when habitual control weakens. Each moment revealed that thought's dominance depends on invisibility, and awareness, even subtle, disrupts its automaticity. Yet awareness is not a weapon. It is a lens. Observation does not erase the controlling thought. It does not obliterate habitual patterns overnight. The loops return, emotions reassert themselves, and memory continues to reinforce. But something fundamental has shifted. Authority is no longer invisible. Repetition is no longer unquestioned. Habit is no longer total. Each lapse, each pause, each subtle noticing introduces space for choice. You are no longer fully governed by patterns that once seemed inevitable. The power of this subtle freedom lies in coexistence. The controlling thought may persist, loops may recur, familiar patterns may dominate temporarily, yet the mind can operate alongside them, observing without surrendering, feeling without automatic reinforcement, and remembering without unquestioned interpretation. The freedom revealed here is quiet, incremental, and often invisible to the casual glance. It does not change everything at once, yet it alters the foundation upon which thought asserts authority. It is both nothing and everything. This realization is not a final destination. It is a threshold, a reminder, a living insight. Control is conditional, perception is curated, and identity is partially constructed. Moments of calm, rupture, and observation accumulate, shaping subtle autonomy. Freedom is not immediate. It is woven into the ongoing interplay between thought, emotion, memory, and awareness. Each act of noticing, each pause of reflection, each quiet observation weakens unquestioned authority and expands consciousness. In the end, the mind is revealed as a space, dynamic, conditional, and participatory. The controlling thought continues to exist, but it no longer dominates invisibly. Awareness now walks alongside it, softly, steadily, and perceptibly. You are neither entirely captive, nor entirely free. You exist in the quiet tension between authority and observation, repetition and noticing, compulsion and choice. And it is within this tension that subtle freedom emerges, the freedom to witness, to pause, and to experience the mind as both structured and fluid, controlled, and alive.